We're so glad you're here for week 2 of the series we started last week called Peaks and Valleys. Peaks and Valleys. How many of you have been through peaks and valleys in your life? Different moments. Yes, we've all had our peak moment, those amazing moments, those moments you write home about, you take a picture of, and then you have all the other moments you don't post on Facebook, you don't tell people about, those valley moments, those seasons, those difficult moments of the week that we all have in our lives. We're studying the life of Elijah. Elijah is an incredible man of God, this great prophet. In fact, we're going to get to the end of the story in a few weeks. We're going to see Jesus standing in the promised land in his own ministry with two people. One's Moses. Moses is a big deal. And Elijah. Elijah's a big deal. Why is Elijah a big deal? Elijah's a big deal because God uses Elijah to bring the people back to him, to turn their hearts back to him, where they have been worshiping other idols, worshiping other gods, worshiping gods like Baal and Asherah and doing all the other things. Even as the people of God, clinging to things that are less than him, God uses Elijah and says, look, it's time for a wake-up call. It's time for us to recognize that there's only one true God, and there's one true God who wants you to have a relationship with him and go on a journey for the rest of your life with them, and God's going to use Elijah to do just that. Last week, we began with Elijah. He shows up to this king named King Ahab. King Ahab said to be the one who's aroused God's anger more than any other king before him. In fact, a lot of the kings have done terrible things, but King Ahab comes forward and he begins to turn the people away from God. He begins to build a temple to Baal. Though he's the king, though he's supposed to lead God's people to God's heart, he's leading them away from God's heart. And then we have Elijah show up before him and says, look, king, things are going to change. You think things are going well. You think you're a powerful king, and he was a powerful king. You think you can control all the things around you. You can't. God is the one that's in control, and it's going to stop raining, and not just for a couple weeks to give you a break, but for 3.5 years, which means your crops are going to die. Your animals are going to die. You're going to go through great hardship and difficulty, and probably people may even die unless you repent and turn back to God. And Elijah shows up and says, Ahab, I know you don't know me, and I don't know you. And I know I'm from a city you've never heard of and a place you can't hardly find on the map. But my name is Elijah. And my name means Yahweh is my God, because he is the only true God. It's the purpose of my life and the destiny that I have. And Elijah shows up and says, King Ahab, I know you're worshiping many gods, but there's only one God, and we are the people of God. We should worship him and him alone. So God takes Elijah, puts him before King Ahab. He gives this incredible message. There's going to be no more rain for 3.5 years. And then God takes Elijah and says, okay, I need you to, number one, run for your life because he's going to try to kill you. Number two, I have more to do in your life. I have some preparation to do in your heart, some things that I want to do inside of you for the things that are yet to come. You're not ready for them. You're not ready for all the things that I want to do with your life. You think this was the moment, and you made it. You did it. You did what I've called you to do, but things are going to get more difficult and more important as it goes. Time for preparation. And he sends him to a ravine called the Kerith Ravine, and he says, look, I know you don't have any food. I know you don't have any water, but I'm going to provide for you there. In fact, the ravens, they're going to bring you breakfast every morning, as crazy as that is, and dinner every evening. Elijah's like, okay, we'll see how that goes. And you're going to drink from a brook. I know it's a drought. I know there's not a lot of water, but there's going to be a brook flowing through that ravine, and you're going to drink from that brook, and I'm going to take care of you. And I want to do a work in you while you're there trusting me, because the reality, what we talked about last week, is God has to do a work in us before he can do a work through us. He has to do a work in us before he can do a work through us. And so God uses Elijah, takes him to the ravine. God spends time with him. He learns to pray, learns to seek God. He spends 6, 12, 18 months there in the ravine. And now we get to the moment where things are going to begin to escalate. They're going to get more difficult, more challenging. And God's going to continue the preparation that he started. If you have a Bible this morning, you can turn with me to 1 Kings chapter 17. Verse 7 through 24 is where we're going to continue where we picked up last week. My message title here this morning is When Everything Goes Wrong. When everything goes wrong. How many of you have ever been through a season or a week when it just seemed like no matter what you did, everything went wrong, right? We've all had those moments. It seems like we try and we're ready and we're excited for the week or whatever it might be. Or you go through a season, it's like, man, I keep doing something, it's off. Things aren't flowing. Things aren't coming together. I know God loves me, but I don't understand why this has happened and that has happened and that has happened. And this is the moment. We're going to get into that moment with Elijah because so far it seems like everything's going right. Well, God's done such incredible things. But Elijah's going to run out of food because God's going to stop sending the food. And Elijah's going to run out of water because God's going to stop sending the water. And God's going to send him to a different place, and he's going to minister to this family, and then the child in the family is going to die, which is going to question everything that Elijah's been doing to that moment. And everything begins to go wrong, seemingly, for Elijah. And yet God is involved in orchestrating every moment. God's got this plan. God's going to do something in Elijah, continued, and through Elijah, that is going to open the eyes of this woman that he's going to encounter as he goes far from home. We start in verse 7 of chapter 17. After he's been in the Kerith ravine for a long time, it says, sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. You see, I can imagine Elijah down there at the brook every day. If you just saw, first of all, ravens bringing you breakfast, ravens bringing you dinner. It's a little weird, but it's the story as it's written. That's what happened. And he's going to the brook every day, and he's drinking from the brook. You know what that's doing for Elijah? It's growing his faith. God said he was going to give me water from the brook, and God is giving me water from the brook. And he drinks every day. It's like, wow, God's providing. God's faithful. God's true. God's doing exactly what he said he's going to do. And this brook becomes a sign of provision and care from God to Elijah. But it says at some moment, that brook, there was provision for God. It dries up even for Elijah. The truth is in our lives, what once was God's provision in our life can dry up. It's just the reality. Sometimes a job you have this job, you're grateful you got this job, you're like, God gave me this job, God led me to this place, God provided, I was praying, I didn't know where I was going to work, I was working somewhere that just wasn't a good environment, and then God gave you a better environment, you're like, wow, God has provided, look what God has done. But even that thing can dry up at some point. That job that once was provision and is incredible, it can just dry up, and it's not the way it used to be. You can have a relationship, a friendship, or a dating relationship, and you think that friendship, hey, we're close, we're talking all the time, whether that's somebody in college or high school or somebody later on in life, and you have this close relationship, but that friendship can dry up too, where you just stop talking as much, you don't call as much, you don't have those connections like you used to. We all have those kind of friends. Or somebody you're dating, you're like, wow, I just think this person might lead to something bigger together. Maybe we'll end up getting married one day, and then suddenly that relationship can dry up as well. In fact, even in ministries where you can be part of a church or doing something for God, that thing can come to an ending, can it? That season that was incredible can suddenly dry up, and you're like, what, God, what is happening? Why is this happening? We all have probably those things in our own life. We're like, we thought this was going to last, right? But it dried up. And the story of Elijah is the story of our story. It's a human story where sometimes things are going well, but they can dry up. But the good news is that a dried up brook is not a sign that God has abandoned us or forgotten about us. A dried up brook can actually often be a sign of God's new direction in our life. New direction. And so God led Elijah to the ravine, but he didn't want Elijah to stay at the ravine forever. He didn't want to keep feeding him every morning and every evening and let him drink from the brook every day forever, because Elijah would have stayed there. Look what God has done. Look how God's provided. I'm not going to walk away from that. But God wanted to take Elijah to the next season of life, to a different place. And in order to get his attention, and God does this in so many ways, sometimes God gets our attention by withholding provision. Sometimes something dries up, a job, our bank accounts, whatever begins to dry up, and we have to begin to pray and ask God, what are you doing? What are you saying to me? What is the message that's in the middle of this? And this is what happens to Elijah. It begins to dry up. And as it dries up, God speaks to Elijah and says, I actually have next things for you to do. That's good news, because every time things dry up, it doesn't mean that I did something wrong or I got off track, though sometimes when things dry up, it's because I did make some mistakes. We all have those moments too, where we hurt a relationship, where you harm a situation, we can get ourselves fired from a job that we love. We can bring some of that about, but when it's not our activity and it seemed like this thing was going to continue, and it comes to a standstill, often is a sign that God's redirecting me. It's not a sign that he abandoned me or forgot about me, but he's taking me from this season to that season. That's incredibly hopeful, because that'll happen in your life and my life, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but over and over and over again. So we say, God, I see this thing's drying up. I don't know why it's drying up. Will you help me understand? Will you help me lean into what you're doing so that I can figure out if it's drying up because something I did and I want to correct it? Great. Or is it drying up because you're moving me on to a different season? Lord, help me to embrace that as well. That's what God's going to do with Elijah. Elijah hasn't done anything wrong. He's been providing. Elijah's been obedient. He's doing everything God's called him to do, but God says, look, I'm going to dry up the brook because now I'm going to move you on to the next season because I did what I wanted to do in you right now in this season. Season complete. Let's put a period on that. It's time to move on to the next step I have in front of you. Chapter 17, verse 8 continues the story. It says, then the word of the Lord came to him. Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. So she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. So he's here at this Kerith ravine. It's a great distance from where he had been. God sends him from Ahab to the Kerith ravine, great distance. And then at the end of it, the brook dries up, and God says, but I have a word for you. I'm going to send you to a different place, to a city called Zarephath, and there a woman will meet you, and she will provide for all of your needs. And he goes, wow, that's incredible. Like, God just keeps doing this. In fact, his faith's starting to build a lot around food. It seems like everything related to Elijah is all about food, and his faith is building around food, and God's going to use him in another food miracle ahead of us because he's seen what God has done before, and he says, okay, well, then I'm going to go to Zarephath. Zarephath is an interesting place because it's outside of Israel. You'd think God would take Elijah and send him to another place in Israel where people would care for him, think about him, be there for him. Instead, he sends him outside of Israel to Zarephath. Zarephath's like the heartland of Baal worship. These are not God's people. They don't care about the things of God. They don't understand the things of God. And God, though, chooses to send him to that place, to this heartland of Baal worship. It's going to test his faith because he's far from home. I moved a lot of years ago. I moved from California to Oklahoma. It's kind of like my Zarephath. They're not my people. I didn't know them. I'd never been to Oklahoma before. And I drove up with my dad the first day of college with my car, and he stayed for about 24 hours. He's like, but I got to get back to work. I was like, what do you mean, already? He's like, yeah, I got to get back to work. He's like, good luck, and he just left me there, far from home. Sometimes in life, those are the moments. This is what it's like for Elijah. He's there all the way far from home in Zarephath. By the way, Zarephath is 100 miles from where he is at the moment. He's in a ravine 100 miles away, and if you have no food and no water, you're like, God, did you get that wrong? I mean, could you send me with some preparation? Couldn't you have allowed the ravens to send me some care packages or something on my way, all the way? But God told Elijah what to do, and Elijah was a man who wanted to do what God told him to do. And Elijah got his stuff together, and he began the trek across the country to Zarephath. There he meets this woman, and he asks her for some water, and then he boldly asks her for some bread. I'd love to just try this sometime. How many of you love Chipotle? Any of you? The first service didn't love Chipotle. How many of you love Chipotle? Let's keep it in business. That'd be great. So I'd love to just try this sometime. You know how they have tables out front of Chipotle where you can just sit outside and you just wait, and it's good weather, you eat outside, all those things. I'd love to challenge anybody to do this. Go down, sit at one of those tables, and do what Elijah did, and just try to make eye contact with every person who comes in the door. Some are going to avoid you, some are going to want to look you in the eye, but then that person looks you in the eye and said, hey, is there any chance you could get me a cup of water? Just start there. Don't tell them the rest of it yet. They're like, that's kind of weird, but yeah, sure, I'll get you a cup of water. And by the way, I love a chicken burrito, double meat, extra guacamole, some chips. It's not such a big deal. And if you could bring that, that'd be amazing. This is what Elijah's doing, only it's almost like you take it further. And she says to him, look, I only have $7 to my name. I just have enough food to buy a meal for myself. Say, hey, it doesn't matter. Just don't be afraid. Trust God. There'll be endless beans and rice at the end of the story. It's not a big deal. How many of you want to do that this week? Yes, okay. I'll join with one or two of you out there. We'll see what happens. This is what God does with Elijah. Elijah says, look, God said a woman's going to provide for me, and this woman appears to be that woman, and he's got just enough faith and just enough boldness to ask her this big ask, will you give me some food? And she says, well, here's the problem. I do have a little bit of food, but it's my last little bit of food. And you imagine the hopelessness in her life. She says, I have a son at home. We're very aware that we're at the very end. And I came out here today. You just happened to grab me at a difficult moment, a difficult season of my life. I'm out here gathering sticks together because I'm going to take them home. We're going to make a fire. We're going to make the last little bit of food we have. And our expectation is that's it. And then we're going to die. We're in there. Well, Elijah's faith has grown, and he senses what God has said, and he won't turn it loose. He's like, but God said that God's going to feed me and provide for me through you. And you can imagine her lack of understanding. She's like, well, God didn't tell me about that. Like, God didn't explain how that's going to work. But he keeps pushing, and his faith is just contagious enough. How many of you know your faith can be contagious to someone else? If you believe God, if you trust God, and you keep speaking that into someone else's life, it might ignite a fire in them that's grown cold that they might actually believe for themselves. And he believes just enough, once again, around food. He's like, God's provided food. He can do it again. And he says, you're not going to run out of food. She's like, what guarantees do I have? He says, I don't have any guarantees for you. I just believe that I believe that God will do what he says he's going to do, and you won't die by providing for me. And the woman, verse 15, just enough faith from him to her. Verse 15, she went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. This is an incredible miracle. The truth is about life, it's not easy to obey God, is it? I mean, the longer you walk with God, the easier it's supposed to be, but it's not easy to obey God. In fact, sometimes it's downright scary to obey God. It's hard to trust when you don't understand how it's going to work out. Now, if she knew the rest of the story, exactly what's going to happen, she'd be like, sure. You mean I can feed you one meal and God's going to feed me like hundreds of meals? No problem. I'd love to do that. If she had that kind of guarantee, but she just had this stranger down at the well telling her this. Scary to obey. Some of you have been asked by God or challenged by other people, or you read it in the Word of God and you feel challenged to do something for God or on behalf of God or turn away from sin or whatever that thing was that was a challenge in your life, and you're like, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can really trust that this is going to work out. It's like the idea of giving financially. The Bible says we're supposed to give off the top of our money, which meant for those people that work their crops, they don't know that anything else is going to grow. They don't know if insects are going to destroy the rest of the crop. They don't know they're going to feed the rest of their family. They're like, you're supposed to give the first of your crops. I don't know if I can trust God in that. I don't know if maybe I can give the last 10%. In fact, I won't give just 10%. If you let me give it last, I'll give 15, 20% because that'll be easier than giving the first. But this is how God always works. He always works because he's calling us to a higher level of faith. And the truth is our obedience matters. In fact, sometimes God will say things to us and the promise is contingent on our obedience. Now, God's love for us isn't contingent on us getting all together. God's care for us isn't contingent on us being perfect. But often God's provision in my life and in your life is contingent on my obedience, on my doing what God told me to do, when God told me to do it, and the way that God told me to do it. It just simply is. And this is what happens for the woman and for Elijah. The good news in the story is that there's often a miracle waiting on the other side of my obedience. If I'll just do what God told me to do, if I'll just go where God told me to go, if I'll just stop doing this thing that God told me to stop doing, often there's a miracle on the other side of our obedience. If we'll just act in faith, say, I sense God leading me here. And if we'll just, like the stories in the Old Testament, we'll just go stand in the river. We'll just go stand in the water. God said he's going to part it, but he hasn't parted it yet. He told us to go stand in the water. So by faith, we're going to go stand in the water. Often there's a miracle waiting on the other side of our obedience that's just not going to come until we do what God has told us to do. This is what happens for this woman and for Elijah. In the moment she makes the food for Elijah, that God begins to unlock the rest of the plan. In fact, I don't understand how it happened. Can you imagine every morning getting up and looking in the flour pot, the oil pot? There's more. There's more than there was yesterday. Using everything you had, and then there was more the next day. And this just continues on and on and on. It says, until God sends rain upon the land, which is probably, if we're just guessing, about 2 years later. 2 years of the food never running out. Now, I can't promise in your life and mine, if I just do something, it's going to work out just like that. I can't promise that. God's got his plan for your life and my life, which might be very similar to Elijah's or very different than Elijah's. But I do know that when we obey, when we do what God tells us to do, that there's often his provision waiting on the other side of our obedience. And until we do what God tells us to do, he's just not going to do what he wants to do on our behalf. I don't know what that is for you. I don't know what things are hanging on. You're like, I feel like I should do this, but you're not doing it yet. Or you feel like you should stop doing something or create distance in your life between what's happening. Look, it's scary to obey, but it's always worth it. It's just always worth it. It's always better to do it God's way than our own way. It just is. This is what happens for the woman and Elijah, and their faith just starts growing. You can imagine, if God did this for you, you're like, hey, I don't know what you believe. I don't know what you believe, but I saw God feed us for 2 years on just a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, and I don't care what you try to talk me out of. You're never going to be able to talk me out of it. This is what happens for the woman. She goes from no faith to this growing faith, to this beginning, this sprouting faith in her life because of what God did for her. We're really building to the climax of the story. If that weren't enough, I mean, God does all these things. He's feeding them, doing all these things, but it's growing to this moment. In fact, this is one of the biggest moments in all of the Old Testament. It may not be a moment that you've read closely for yourself, but this is a huge moment that's going to speak to moments that are yet to come in the future for Israel and that we are gathered here today to celebrate together. Chapter 17, verse 17, moves on to the rest of the story. It says, sometime later, so there's sometime later, the brook dried up. Sometime later, God had fed them. But sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse, and finally he stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, what do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? What's happening here? She's having a crisis of faith. She's seen God do something. Her faith just began to emerge, but she doesn't have a great roots of faith. She hasn't seen God do many different things, and she begins to say, you know what? I remember who I used to be. Maybe God was just playing a trick on me. Maybe God isn't really good. Maybe God kept us alive just to sort of torture us, give us hope, and then steal life from us. And Elijah begins to have the same sort of crisis of faith. Why? Because their roots just aren't fully developed yet. I'll bet in your life and mine, we've all had a crisis of faith. Why do I believe that? Because all the great men and women of the Bible, they all had a crisis of faith. The saddest thing about crisis of faith is that we think no one else has it, so we don't tell anybody. I'm struggling to believe. I'm struggling to trust. I'm struggling. We keep that hidden, and it gains more power in our hearts than it would be if you just said, hey, Andrew, I just want to tell you, I'm having a crisis of faith. He'd say, look, I had one too. It was several years ago. This is how I dealt with it, how I wrestled with it, and this is how God made my faith stronger as a result of going through that hard time. But if you lost a loved one who you prayed for, you lost a marriage that you tried to make work, you lost a job that you didn't think you should deserve, those things bring a crisis of faith. Is God still good? Is God still present? Is God still see me? Is God still involved in my life? Is God still as involved as he used to be? I mean, I know he used to be, but it appears that he's forgotten me, or he's frustrated with me, or mad with me. And this is what happens for this young woman's faith, this mother's faith, as her child dies in the middle of what otherwise was a great story. And so God's going to do something about it to make sure that what he started doesn't come undone. Chapter 17, verse 19, "Give me your son," Elijah replied. And he took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." And the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. And Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house, and he gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." So what God does in this moment, he takes their faith that's struggling, sees this crisis, and he's going to speed track it because God has things for Elijah to know about him and his power and his might. He's going to take his growing maturity, he's going to fast forward it and grow it in a very quick way. And sometimes in our lives, we have those moments where our faith just grows incredibly fast. Maybe we give our life to the Lord. We begin to follow God for the first time, and our faith grows, but then you have something else that happens. And those forks in the road are huge moments in our life. And this is the moment for not just the woman, but also for Elijah. Because Elijah says, "God, what are you doing? I don't get it. I don't understand how this has happened. Are you bringing harm to this family that you sent me to meet and minister to and love and care for?" And he goes, and Elijah goes to the woman. This woman, you can just, for those of you who have children, you put yourself in the story. She's lost her son. It's her only child. She's not married. She's a widow. This is her whole family. She's lost her child. And Elijah goes to her and takes this child in his arms and takes it from this heartbroken mother's arms. And he takes the child and he says, "Where do I go? What do I do?" And he carries the child upstairs. And he takes the child in his arms and he lays the child on his bed and he gets on his knees. He gets on his knees in this house and he says, "God, I don't even know what to pray. I don't know what to do. What do I do with a lifeless body? What do I pray for? God, I need to ask you to do the impossible. I don't know if it's even right to ask you to do that. I don't know if it's even appropriate. God, I don't know. You've never told me how to do this or if I should do it, but I'm carrying this child." And he lays that child on his bed, and he had prayed to God for countless hours in that room. He had sought God, and he said, "God, I don't know where else to go. I'm going to go where I've met with you before." And he takes that child to where he's met with God, and he lays that child down. And it says he lays on top of the child. And he says, "God, I need you to do something here that only you can do. I need you to do the impossible so that this woman's faith can continue. And frankly, God, I need you to do the impossible so that I can continue to believe like I have been believing up to this point." And it says he cried out to God. And I don't know what that sounded like or what that looked like or what that environment was like. I don't know how long it took. I know he laid on the child the first time, nothing happened. Second time, nothing happened. Third time, God began to do something in that child's body that only God could do. By the way, the Christian faith is built around the idea of resurrection. Our whole faith is built around this idea that there was this man who walked and talked among us, who went to a cross, died, but rose again on the third day. I mean, this is why we gather on Sundays, by the way, because our whole faith would have led us to maybe a belief that we'd meet every Saturday, but we're like, let's meet on the third day, the Sunday, because that's the day that the resurrection occurred. It's this whole faith built around it. There's 10 resurrections in the Bible. Elisha, the man who will come after Elijah, performs 2 of them, one when he's alive and one when he's dead. The one when he's alive, he prays for another child to come back to life, and there's a resurrection. The second time that Elisha brings about a resurrection, he's dead. His bones are buried. His body's in a tomb, and they're walking by, and they have this dead body. They're like, we don't know where to put him. Let's put him in the old cave that's over here. Let's go bury the body over there. And it says it touches Elisha's bones, and it springs up to life. In the New Testament, there's 5 resurrections around the life of Jesus. He resurrects three times, if I remember right. His own life is resurrected, and then there's a lot of people that are resurrected at the crucifixion and the resurrection. Peter resurrects someone, and Paul resurrects someone. 10 resurrections in the Bible. The important part of that detail here is there's never been a resurrection before Elijah. Elijah has no instruction manual. There's no precedence. In other words, at least if I'm Elisha, I'm like, well, Elijah did it. I mean, God used Elijah to raise him, so maybe it's not crazy for me to pray for a resurrection. I don't know what God will do, but maybe it's not crazy for me to pray for it, but at least we've seen it happen before. But Elijah has none of that. He has no sense that it's even possible, and he goes to God and says, God, I don't know if it's even like appropriate for me to pray this bigger prayer. I don't know if you even want me to pray this kind of prayer. But God, I've seen you move already, and I believe you're capable, and I believe you care, and I believe you brought me to this moment for a reason, to this family for a reason. So God, I'm going to cry out to you. I'm going to cry out to you, and I'm going to pray, God, will you do the impossible so that your name and your renown, so that everyone might know that you are the true God. Ahab's saying there's a lot of gods. This woman believed in other gods before now. Will you make it clear, so clear, that this boy will walk and talk the rest of his life and have to tell the story that the true God, the only true God, raised him from the dead. It says he cried out to God, and God raised him from the dead. I started reading about the life of Elijah somewhere in August. For myself, not related to preaching. I had no intentions to preach anything on Elijah. In fact, I've never heard anyone preach a series on Elijah. Part of the reason is Elijah's story is very complicated. It's not simple. It's not straightforward. There's a lot happening in the story. But I was reading it for myself, not in preparation, just say, God, I continually try to read through the Bible, pray through the Bible, ask God to show me what it means for my own life. And I'm reading about Elijah, and I'll just be honest. Of the whole series, here's my major takeaway, mine. For me, I read this story, and I said, God, there's a big difference between the kind of prayers I'm praying and the kind of prayers that Elijah's praying. And I'm not sure why that is. But I'm praying some safe prayers. And I'm praying some reasonable prayers. And I'm praying some possible prayers. Maybe because I don't want to put my heart out there so much that I want to be disappointed. Maybe because I think it wouldn't be appropriate. I don't know, God, what is that? And I began to just journal and say, God, I want to be a man who prays like Elijah prayed and trusts like Elijah trusts, who seeks you like Elijah sought you. I want to be that kind of man who's praying bigger prayers than I'm praying. I wrote down in my journal, I'll put it on the screen this morning, I just wrote down the simple question, when was the last time I prayed for a miracle? When was the last time I prayed for the miracle? If the message today is this idea is, what do we do when everything goes wrong around us? When the brook dries up, when the food runs out, when the provision runs out, when we don't know what to pray, we don't know how to obey, when obedience seems difficult, when all those things, when our worst fears come to pass, what do we do when all things begin to unwind around us? Elijah would say to us, get on your knees and go seek the one who spoke the universe into existence. Go seek that one, because if he can create the heavens and the earth in 7 days, if he can bring life out of dust, if he can breathe life into Adam and make him walk and talk, then he can deal with the things that I'm dealing with. Now, what I know at the end of the story is it's possible God could say no. And God could say no to my prayers. It's not like how much I believe them means how likely they are to come true. That's just not how that works. It's God's will and God's alone that matters. But when I pray big prayers, you know what? God will look at me and say, now I think you're getting it. I think you're getting it. And God wouldn't say, look, I'm offended. You're praying too big of prayers, Brad. I think he'd say to me, it's about time. Because when I pray big prayers, I'm acknowledging that he's a big God. When I pray big prayers, it means I'm not depending on myself. It means I'm depending on him. When I pray big prayers, it's turning my heart back towards him rather than towards other solutions and toward myself. And when I pray big prayers, I acknowledge, God, you're the King of Kings. You're the Lord of Lords. You are the Alpha. You are the Omega. You are the beginning and the end. Who else would I go ask for help? And God would say, sometimes I will say yes. Sometimes I will say no. And to that we say, I will trust you even still. It's like the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember the story maybe as a kid? Some of you grew up around church. I know not everybody did here this morning. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're not going to bow down before Nebuchadnezzar. They're not going to do that. God says not to bow down before us. We're not going to bow down. And Nebuchadnezzar says, then we're going to throw you in the fiery furnace, and we're going to turn it up a few notches and make it even hotter. We're going to try to scare you into compliance. And they said, we're not going to do it. And they say to Nebuchadnezzar, our God will deliver us from the fire. But even if he does not, still we will not bow down. This is what Elijah's doing. My God, you can heal him. You can bring him back to life. I know no one else has come back to life, but God, I just believe if you can feed me with ravens breakfast, I think you can handle this also. I know it's a big prayer, but I'm honoring you. You're the God of the universe. And God says, there's a prayer and there's a man who I can use to accomplish my purposes. James 5 says, the prayers of a righteous man availeth much. They do a lot. They accomplish a lot. Why? Because Elijah's perfect. Elijah's not perfect, but Elijah loves God and is endeavoring to be obedient to God, endeavoring to seek God. He's the one who's been on his knees all the other days when there wasn't a big thing to pray about. And this day when he gets there, he says, where do I go? I'm going to go back to the one I've been praying for. I don't know what you've been praying for. I don't know what you're going through. I know in a room this size, there are many tragedies that have happened or we're in the middle of going through right now. I know there's struggles that we're going through, whether it's simplicity of finances and jobs or whether it's bigger stuff like relationships and marriages and families and maybe some of your grown kids, all those I know there's stuff going on. When was the last time we prayed for a miracle is the question. And trusted God to do what only God can do for us. Verse 22, as I close the message today, so many other things I'd like to say. Verse 22, it says, the Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. This is the gospel. There is a good God who cares and is listening. And when we seek him, he hears us. And he's so good that we can trust him whether he says yes or says no to our request. Because that's just who he is. And he's inviting us. The gospel would say he's inviting us. He says, I'm not going to abandon you or forsaken you. I'm going to listen to you. And when you seek me with all your heart, you will find me. This is the gospel. And I don't know where everybody is here this morning, what your issue is. Get on your knees and pray. And seek him. If whatever your provision, whatever that thing that was going well is drying up, say, God, what are you saying? What does this mean? How are you redirecting me? If there's something God's told you to do in obedience to him, then stop delaying it. That's a message for me and for you. Don't delay. Just move forward. It's worth it when I obey. There's a miracle waiting on the other side of my obedience that will never happen until I do what God says. And get on my knees and say, God, you specialize in the impossible. So, Lord, I'm going to seek you for the impossible today. I'm going to pray, and I'm going to trust that you're going to do what's best with my request. This is the gospel. This is the heart. This is the life of Elijah. Don't you love that we can peer into the life of human beings who sought God, and we can learn how to do the same? It's incredible. Let's stand to our feet, and let's pray